When I talk to Kevin, by the way, I'm going to ask him about, as I say, I'm giving him a chance to get prepared. I'm going to ask him about who these people, the Straussians, are. Sometimes you hear that term. I want him to explain who they are and what it is that they believe. And there's a real relationship between them and the Neocons. So this may get a little technical, but just be patient with us dealing with that, because once we get beyond that, we're talking about U.S. history and the founding period and Revolutionary Virginia and the Constitution and the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions. This is all going to be great stuff, but I'm sorry I have to start off with something a little bit technical, a little inside baseball, but for the sake of thoroughness, I definitely want to cover it. So who is Kevin Gutzman? Well, among other things, he is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution. He's the author most recently of James Madison and the Making of America, which is now out in paperback from St. Martin's, which is a major, major publisher. And he and I wrote a book together called Who Killed the Constitution back in 2008. We had a good time doing that. Kevin is also full professor of history at Western Connecticut State University, where he is also the director of graduate studies. Kevin Gutzman, I really appreciate you being on the show.
Very happy to be here, Tom.
You know, I'm sure I'm going to have you as a regular guest. I mean, I don't know how I'll have to coerce you one way or another. Somehow I'll get you on as a regular guest, and we'll have plenty of current events to talk about. But for now, what I kind of want to do, maybe we'll get to current events at the end, but what I've been doing in some of these opening programs of the show is I'm trying to highlight the work of a lot of the people I respect and just dive into it and expose people to what it is that people like you do. So, for example, you are a biographer of James Madison. I mean, your book, James Madison and the Making of America, which is now in paperback from St. Martin's. I mean, St. Martin's is a big-time publisher. Like, that's fantastic that you have that book. Not to mention your other stuff, but the Madison biography is really great, and it's got all these great reviews by mainstream people. Like, you do good work, and it gets recognized. I mean, I know I'm on a soapbox here for a minute, but I think sometimes young academics get so discouraged because they feel like academia is against us, and no matter what you do, it's never going to be acknowledged because, you know, you have some ideological point of view that's different from the mainstream. But you and others have shown that good work in academia is still acknowledged and rewarded. I mean, am I reading too much into this?
Well, I think it can be acknowledged and rewarded somewhat. That is, I don't think you're as apt to end up with a chaired position at Princeton if you're not a Keynesian skeptic, endorser of Franklin Roosevelt. So it's not impossible to have a career that you're happy with, but it's not going to be the career of somebody who's got those views, those attitudes.
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, no one in our line of thought or in our pedigree is going to chair the department at Harvard, certainly, but you've shown without making any concession to anybody that you can have a really, really solid academic publishing record and not betray your conscience in any way. And that's encourages me, and I'm glad to see it in your case. Now, you had a book that was probably your most academic book, Virginia's American Revolution. And I think people who aren't attuned to the issues at stake might not realize the significance of your findings there, because you are obviously very knowledgeable about Virginia, particularly around the time of the ratifying convention, but that whole period from in the latter part of the 18th century into the early 19th century. So I want to start there, because you have happened upon some findings and some research that seems to run counter to what you would hear from, let's say, a Straussian. So let's first explain to people, what is a Straussian, and what does a Straussian say about the founding period of American history, and what does Kevin Gutzman say?
Oh, boy. Well,
we can do that for the rest of the show if you want.
Well, there was a German expatriate philosopher named Leo Strauss who carved out a small niche on the right in academia, and there are people who consider themselves Straussians who follow in his line of thinking and his line of writing about some of the great philosophical figures like Plato and Socrates and Machiavelli and so on. But The ones who are of more immediate interest to American historians are what are called the West Coast Straussians, who are followers, really kind of cult of one of Strauss's students, a fellow named Harry Jaffa. And Jaffa is essentially an idolater of Abraham Lincoln. That is, somebody who said that Lincoln is the ultimate Aristotelian, that he was this wonderful philosophical statesman who penetrated to the essence of Republican self-government in a way that nobody else ever had. And so there's an attempt by Jaffa and following him various lesser and far lesser lights to cast the entire American revolutionary experience in such a way as to make Lincoln's statesmanship a fulfillment of it. So what that entails often is downplaying or just ignoring contrary evidence, and they also are prone to personal attacks, most famously in the instance when the Reagan administration contemplated elevating Mel Bradford to a position at the head of the National Endowment for the Arts, and
Humanities.
Straussians were central to killing that effort. But essentially what they have said is that the union of the states, the union pre-existed the revolution. That is, it started really at least as early as 1774 and perhaps earlier than that, and that thereby one American people made the revolution, one American people established its independence instead of 13 discrete North American former colonies, and that these people set up their new nation on the basis of the single philosophical proposition described by the Continental Congress in the words of Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. So anything that happens in American government or politics that's inconsistent with the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence, the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, as interpreted by Lincoln and understood by the Straussians, is foreign, hostile, to be downplayed, denigrated, stamped out.
You've already hit on quite a few important issues, and I want to focus in on one of them for now. The Straussians obviously have latched on to this idea of the United States as consisting of one people, so they are inclined to accept, and not more than accept, proselytize for the nationalist theory of the Union, and they don't admit contrary evidence. So, of course, if you're saying that their whole scholarship is intended to culminate in and show that the American experience culminates in Lincoln, then they have to hold to the view that secession is unconstitutional because America is one people and it's one country, it's one big blob. That's the way they're going to tell the story, and they're going to portray the founding as being all about that. But what is there in the corpus of, let's say, Gutzmania out there in your work that would run counter to that?
Well, first let me say that I did not go into doing work in the era of the revolution with the idea that I would try to disprove the Jaffa thesis or the West Coast Straussian view of things. It just happened that I came upon evidence that showed that they were completely mistaken, or if not mistaken, intentionally trying to mislead people. For example, in 1776, the Virginia Convention, which was the ruling convention in Virginia, the ruling body in Virginia after the governor fled, after the last royal governor decided that things aren't looking good for my health if I stay here in Virginia. The ruling convention wrote the first American Declaration of Rights and Constitution, and in the process of adopting the Declaration of Rights, they considered a proposal by George Mason's committee saying that all men are born free and equal and government is responsible for protecting their rights. An objection was made to this proposal to the effect that Well, if we start by saying all men are born free and equal and government is responsible for protecting their rights, then we're going to have either to have a social convulsion in the middle of the revolution we're now fighting, or we're going to have to ignore our own stated principles because, of course, we know in Virginia all men aren't born free and equal. In fact, half of them are born slaves. And so what happened was that the Virginia Convention decided unanimously, with nobody arguing to the contrary even, that they would say that when you enter into a state of society, government is responsible for protecting your rights. And the point is that they were deciding that the African slaves among them were not part of this society. So here from the beginning, we have a complete rejection of what later would be the Straussian idea that the North American former English colonies, now states, were dedicated to the proposition that all men were created equal, and the governments of these states were responsible for pushing this thesis wherever it might lead. Another part of the story that contradicts the West Coast Straussian version is that these people in Virginia, and I've done my work on Virginia, that's why I keep mentioning Virginia solely, but there are other states that have similar evidence. The people of Virginia, when they ratified the federal Constitution, understood that theirs was as one of the three leading Federalist spokesmen in the Virginia Ratification Convention put it, 13 parties to a compact, not one part of one party. In other words, the Federalist spokesman for the Constitution in the summer of 1788 in Richmond, meeting to decide whether their Commonwealth of Virginia would agree to live under this new federal Constitution, told the other delegates that we are one of 13 parties. And of course, the 13 parties were the states, the separate sovereign peoples of the individual states, and not we are part of one great American people deciding here whether the Constitution will be ratified. And not only that, but the Federalist spokesman also said, in case the federal government abuses its powers, we can reclaim them. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means, in other words, pulling out of the Union, taking back the powers we're giving them and saying we're not going to agree that you have any more powers anymore. So this, too, is contrary to the Straussian idea that was invented by Lincoln, as far as I know, that the Union existed even before independence, even before the Revolution started. His theory was that there already was this union of the states as one people, and it's just balderdash. There's nothing in the record of the ratification dispute in Virginia to indicate that anybody thought that the measure of goodness of the proposed federal Constitution was the extent to which it was consistent with the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Nobody mentioned this notion. Nobody thought that. Literally, there is no record that anyone thought what the Straussians say everybody agreed to. So, there are many junctures in the story of the early republic at which one can ask oneself, well, is what's going on here in Virginia consistent with the Straussian explanation or account? And the answer is always no. No, never did the Virginians agree we're one of 13 parts of one American people, but instead they repeatedly came back to this idea that the sovereign unit in American federal politics was the state. And what does the words, this claim was made over and over and over. And there were people who were saying, no, we don't like this idea in the 1780s, 90s, 1800s, 18-teens, 1820s. Commonly, they would intentionally confuse the issue by saying, well, no, in America, we know it's not the state governments that are sovereign, it's the American people. But the claim that was being made was not that the state governments were sovereign, it was that the states were sovereign. As Madison explained in his report of 1800, the word state here meant the sovereign people of each state. So it wasn't that Virginians said that the government in Richmond had unlimited authority. What they were saying was that the sovereign people of Virginia had ultimate authority. And, well, actually, one notable Virginia political philosopher objected to that idea, too. He said ultimate authority is in God, but in politics, ultimate authority is in the people. So, in any event, for Jaffa and the Straussians, ultimate authority was in one national people. And how do we know what one national people thought? Well, typically the way they would answer that question would be by interrogating the scattered writings and speeches of Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
So you essentially start with whatever Lincoln said, and you know that that's accurate.
Well, let me ask this question. I mean, just to play devil's advocate here, the Straussians would come back at some of what you said, and they would say, when we read Virginians saying that, in extreme cases, or whenever the Constitution shall be perverted to their injury or oppression, that they may recall the powers delegated. They're not speaking of withdrawing from the Union, because that's metaphysically impossible. They were speaking rather of their reserved right to exercise the right of revolution, which nobody disputed at that time. Sure, we agree. Sure, Virginia, any other state could rise up and have an extra-legal revolt, but they weren't saying they could have a constitutional secession. How do you answer that?
Well, it's a funny idea, because this notion of a right of revolution that's distinct from a right of secession was first elaborated in the Nullification Crisis, chiefly by James Madison, but not solely by him. And this was to try to downplay the fact that Virginians had been told you're one of 13 parties to a compact. And actually, in one of the major speeches in the Virginia Ratification Convention, in which the Federalist leadership said that Virginia was going to be one of 13 parties to a compact, the orator, whose name was George Nicholas, and who was a notable state-level politician at the time, who came from a family notable for several generations of prominent politicians. His brother was a senator, for example, who ended up being an in-law of Jefferson's. And his father was the last colonial treasurer of Virginia. He said, when you have a compact, the interpretation given to the compact at the time of its signing by one of the parties is binding on the other parties. If one of the parties in signing says, here's what I understand this to mean, or if it makes clear that it understands the words to mean what they clearly import, then that's binding on the other parties. And in case the other parties refuse to live up to that understanding, then that party is absolved of its responsibility under the compact. So it's not that these people were saying, in case we think the central government is becoming oppressive, we're free to throw off government. What they were saying was, in case the federal government abuses the powers we're delegating to it, we're able to take them back. The phrase he used was reclaim them. So for Virginia to reclaim the rights it was granting to the Congress or to the federal government would not mean Virginia was now going into a state of nature, entering into a state of revolution. Rather, it would mean that it was pulling out of a federal agreement. And in the late 18th century, the leading authority on these matters, the leading expositor of the idea of a federal union was a Swiss named Emmerich de Vattel. Vattel said that a federal union was one in which you had an agreement among the parts. Each of them was bound, and it basically explained it the way I've just explained that the Federalists sold the federal union here in the Richmond Ratification Convention. So the point is, there was nothing controversial about this explication of the act of ratification. This was nothing unusual, and it did not require revolution for one of the parties to a federal union to withdraw the powers it had delegated. That was inherent in the idea of a federal union. The ultimate authority would remain, that is, the ultimate authority to elaborate the meaning of the compact through which the federal union had been created remained in the parties to the compact. And of course, you find exactly this same explanation given by leading Virginia Republicans in 1798 when they draft the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions for the adoption of the legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky, which formerly had been part of Virginia, and so it was full of Virginians. This is nothing odd, and it has nothing to do with a right of revolution. They weren't thinking of overthrowing government. They were thinking of withdrawing from a federal compact.
All right, now that, I think for some people that might seem like inside baseball, but that's really that issue of whether they were talking about the right of revolution or the right of secession as being a constitutional remedy is a central issue. And that then you hit on the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions. I want to, in the limited time we have left, I want to shift gears and talk about that. And again, an issue that, again, for some people this may be too much detail, but, I don't want to just skim the surface here. I want to get really deep below. I mean, you've talked a lot about the idea of nullification and Virginia-Kentucky resolutions, but I want to talk about the specific issue that we hear a lot today where people will say, well, look, in the Virginia resolutions drafted by Madison, clearly he's contemplating something less extreme than Jefferson was contemplating in the Kentucky resolutions of 1798, especially in his first draft, and that Madison is calling for something much tamer. And now you've disputed this in a scholarly article, so how do you dispute that, and can you clear this up for us?
Well, this is very frustrating. In theory, the way that academia works is you go out and you do research, and you write up the results of your research, and then you publish the results of your research in scholarly journals, which people read. And having read the results of your research, they modify their own understandings on the basis of what you've taught them. So what I did was I wrote an article about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. I used evidence that has never been adduced by anybody else, which is the record of the discussions of the Virginia resolutions in the Virginia legislature. People commonly refer to the Virginia resolutions of 1798 as Madison's resolutions, and then they go on and quote what Madison said in private or what he said 3 decades later, or, to try to figure out what the Virginia resolutions meant. But I think it makes more sense to look for the meaning of the Virginia resolutions of 1798, not to what their unknown draftsman said in 1798. And remember, Madison's identity as the draftsman was not known to the public for 10 years. It was secret even to the people in the political elite. For 10 years, nobody knew that he had written them. So it wasn't that people thought, well, here we're ratifying whatever Madison thinks of the federal union. Instead, the meaning of the Virginia resolutions ought to be found in the discussions in the legislature, where the proponents sold them to the majority of the legislature. And what happened in the Virginia legislature, in the Virginia House of Delegates in 1798, was that people sold an understanding of the Virginia resolutions as meaning exactly what the Kentucky version meant. That is, the legislative sponsor was a fellow named John Taylor of Caroline, to whom I alluded earlier, and he had added language saying that in case the federal legislature adopted a policy that was unconstitutional and dangerous, it could be the states had the right and were in duty bound to interpose, and these policies were, quote, null, void, and of no force or effect. Well, some people, Federalists, in the Virginia legislature objected to this language, null, void, and of no force or effect, that had been added by John Taylor of Caroline. And so the story goes, Madison heard that this had been done. He told a couple of people he knew that he would like it removed. Federalists in the legislature said that they wanted this language removed, and it was removed, and this shows that the Virginia version was tamer than Jefferson's version in Kentucky. But if you look at what people actually said in the Virginia legislature, you'll see that they removed this phrase null, void, and of no force or effect, not because they thought it was too radical, but because, as one of the leading Republican spokesmen, one of the leading proponents of the resolutions said, well, really, this is just redundancy. We've already said that these laws are unconstitutional. That is, any law that's in excess that involves the Congress claiming power in excess of what the Constitution gave it. And so if you say that this kind of law is unconstitutional, that includes null, void, and of no force or effect. I don't have any objection to removing the redundancy and just leaving it unconstitutional. And so the other Republicans agreed, okay, we can remove that language. So it doesn't mean that they thought this was going to be a tamer statement at all. In fact, they expressly disclaimed the idea that it was a tamer statement. In fact, they thought that removing this language changed the meaning of the resolutions 0%. Now, as I said, I published this in one of the leading journals in American history. In fact, the second most cited journal in American history is the Journal of Southern History, where I published this article in 2000. And people continue to talk about the Virginia resolutions of 1798 as if they were Madison's, and as if the way to understand what they meant is to ask, what did Madison say about them 34 years later? Well, Madison wasn't in the legislature in 1798. As I said before, nobody knew that he had drafted these resolutions that John Taylor was sponsoring. And apparently James Barber, who lived on the plantation next door to Madison's, when he stood up and said, well, this is just redundancy, it's okay to remove it, he didn't think that this meant that it was a tamer version. So the ongoing insistence on asking, well, how did Madison read these things when he was responding to the Nullification Crisis in the 1830s, I think has got to be tendentious. That is, I think people are doing this on purpose. I have encountered some people who clearly hadn't read the material and hadn't really digested what I was doing in my article, but I think the fact that people just overlook the point has got to be tendentious. And one reason I think that is that the leading account saying that what we need to do is to look to what Madison said about this, decades later, was published in the William and Mary Quarterly, another scholarly journal, in 1948, and it was preceded by an editorial note saying, a 2-page editorial statement from the editor of the William and Mary Quarterly saying, there's a big dispute going on within the Democratic Party today between Senator Byrd and President Truman, and we are pleased to be able, with the publication of this article, to show that Senator Byrd is mistaken and President Truman is correct. So the whole thing was done intentionally to buttress the claims of President Truman, essentially along a Lincolnian line in 1948. And I think, without regard to the question, what did the Virginia legislature actually think it was doing in adopting the Virginia resolutions? So even today, you have Straussians making the same kind of argument, and other scholars commonly make this argument. Another obvious explanation for why people would come to this conclusion is it's just much easier to go to the library and get the papers of James Madison than it is to go read through the record of the Virginia legislature in 1798. The papers in James Madison are to be found in every decent college library, and the record of the Virginia General Assembly is available in half a dozen places. So that's another explanation. But the bottom line is the Virginia legislature in 1798 was reiterating this claim that I was describing before, that it had been one of the parties to this compact. It had ultimate authority to police the behavior of the constitutional authorities that had been empowered by the Constitution, because Virginia was one of the entities that made this Constitution. So there were several junctures through the early Republic when the question how the Constitution was to be read came up, and each time leading Virginia figures in the Virginia General Assembly said, well, the Constitution is to be read the way I've just described.
Well, Kevin, we are out of time, but I can't thank you enough for this, because just the information you've shared with us here is pretty much known by almost nobody, and you're helping to spread it to mankind, and I'm grateful to you for your work, for your books, for I enjoyed working on Who Killed the Constitution with you, and also I'm very glad to be able to say that I'm always on this program, I talk about libertyclassroom.com, And when I started that project, I thought the first person I called was Kevin. I said, I need to have somebody else I trust on here doing some of the courses with me. So if you want to hear Kevin, he's in our U.S. History to 1877. He does our constitutional history course. This is not going to be what you'll get in in any law school. It's not going to be what you'll get in any history department. And it's not even going to be what you get from the Heritage Foundation. I mean, sometimes these can be even the worst on some particular issues. This is going to be the real Jeffersonian thing. So, Kevin, once again, I appreciate your time.
You're welcome, Tom. I was happy to do it.
All right, everybody, that is all the time we have. My thanks to Kevin Gutzman, kevingutzman.com. His last name is Gutzman, so kevingutzman.com is where you can visit him. Visit him also at libertyclassroom.com, where he teaches courses with me. You can learn systematically U.S. history and the Constitution while driving your car and not feeling like you're wasting your commute. So check that out with coupon code SHOW in all caps. You always get a discount. Finally, make sure and follow me on Facebook. I love to participate in some of these threads on Facebook, but it's hard to find me on Facebook. I'm not on there as Tom Woods. So visit TomWoodsRadio.com and click the like button on the Facebook widget. That would really make me happy. All right, that's it, everybody. Thanks so much. We'll see you again next week. 10 shows under our belt already. It's already flown by. See you next week.
The Tom Woods Show.